Hello and welcome back to another episode. Now today I want to talk a little bit about a book which I picked up over the Christmas holiday. As I've already mentioned in the previous video, you're well aware that my lovely in-laws and my brother-in-law were over for Christmas, and they love, well, in particular, my mother and father-in-law love going into Toon. They love going into the middle of Newcastle and availing themselves of, in particular, the bookshops, because they're from the back of beyond in Northern Ireland. Belfast, it seems they've bled dry, so Newcastle once or twice a year is their secondary sort of book donor victim. And so I found myself over Christmas going into Newcastle a bit more frequently than I normally would. In so much as we went in consecutive days, pretty much for a week. And that led to a couple of interesting scenarios. One of them, though, was particularly interesting because I was banished from Forbidden Planet while my mother-in-law bought me a present, and a Christmas present, obviously. And so I went to the bookshop next door, and that was Geek Retreat. Now, Geek Retreat is a quasi-independent sort of geek emporium. Lots of people playing card games and tournaments. There's an open sort of couch for console gaming, but also there's my favourite shelf in the northeast of England, and that is the second-hand graphic novel and comic book shelf. And it is there that once again I found a little treasure, and that is Batman Cacophony. Now, what drew my attention to this book was actually the fact that across the top it proudly sort of states, Kevin Smith, and I was like, is that the Kevin Smith, as in, Mallrats Chasing Amy and Clerks, Silent Bob, is that him? And I flipped the book over, and sure enough, on the back there's a picture of Kevin there clutching a cat or a kitten, looking all kind of authory. and this piqued my interest because obviously he does, for example, Fat Man on Batman. He's been involved with the Green Arrow TV series. I might be wrong there, but he's certainly in that world, and I wanted to see what would come out of his head in terms of a comic book. And it seems that so did he. In the introduction to this book, he actually talked about how this was something that he had a hunger to do. He brought his friend in, the artist, I'll just check my notes here, Walt Flanagan, and the two of them who had grown up together, talking about what they would do in, for example, especially a Batman comic, had their opportunity and their chance to do that with this 3-part series running between 2008 and 2009. So I picked this book up extremely excited to read it, and I was even more excited when I opened the cover, and on the dust jacket it talked about onomatopoeia and the definition of the word onomatopoeia. This is a word that sounds like the sound that it's describing. So splat, this kind of thing, blam, kapow. And it was asking the question, would one of these words be the final noise that Batman himself hears in his caped crusade? Would kasplat be the final moment of Batman's life? I found that a really interesting question. And then it seems that he'd actually built a supervillain, or a villain at least, around that question, around the word onomatopoeia, but also the question of someone who only makes sounds that are in comic books. I'll return to that in just a moment, but this piqued my interest. This was a very clever notion, and I thought, yes, Kevin, you're onto something there. Now, there's going to be no spoilers in this particular video. If you want to read this story, hopefully you'll still be able to read it without a sense really of what's going to happen. But this story is set in the context of a turf war between the Joker, who in this story is called an urban terrorist, and Maxi Zeus. Maxi Zeus being a lesser-known Batman villain. He is a Greek businessman who at times slips into the psychotic belief that he is in fact the king of the Greek gods, and his club Olympus, which actually does turn up, for example, in the Arkham City game, and in other Batman sort of lore. Is the club from where he rules his little empire, but he is nonetheless a low-level crime boss in Gotham. Other characters do make appearances as well. We have Deadshot, Zaz, and of course Onomatopoeia, who actually first appeared in a Green Arrow comic. And Kevin Smith said this about it. When I did Green Arrow, I went with Onomatopoeia for a villain, just because I loved that word. And it kind of forms the character in as much as he would say sounds out loud. It only kind of works, I think, on a comic book page, because if you have a gun going off, they usually write blam, and then you can have, you know, the character saying blam in a word balloon. But if you try to do that cinematically, you can't really rock it, he says. That is an interesting element there, and I think it's a true point. Onomatopoeia, as interesting as the character potentially is, does have his limits. He's not going to be appearing in the DC EU or whatever in the films, but on the comic book page there's an interesting potential, which we will return to. Now, in terms of dialogue, actually, there is some problems in issue 1, and this is actually acknowledged by Kevin Smith in his introduction there. Supposedly after issue 1 was published, there was a bit of a criticism that some of the dialogue, especially as said by Batman, doesn't really sound natural when said out loud. And yeah, that's true, that is true. But the problem is, I'm not sure if I would have noticed it quite so much had it not been pointed out in Kevin's intro. But actually, in that sense, he does deserve props for being vulnerable in this book. In the introduction, he mentions that as a potential weakness of part 1, and also actually right at the end of the story, we have a script. We have a script laid out, I think, for part 3. And the script includes a whole page which he acknowledges is just terrible. It's basically Joker dialogue, which is nowhere to be seen in the story. But being open to that and actually sharing it shows that he is, in that sense, a fan of the medium, and he respects his audience enough to be interested in the process as much as they're interested in the final outcome. So even though I'm highlighting some criticisms here, I really do acknowledge and appreciate how vulnerable Kevin Smith has made himself in this publication, and therefore, actually, I feel as though I'm along for the experiment with him, as opposed to watching his every move with a critical eye. Now, there are some truly wonderful moments in this story. We have a mysterious opening, for example, with someone trying to break in to Arkham Asylum. Zaz, as I say, does turn up, and the portrayal of Zaz in this story is, this may well be just how modern Zaz is. I haven't read some comic books, including, well, I haven't read Zaz, that is to say, for a little while, or storylines with Zaz in. But the way he's portrayed in this is he's a little less intelligent than he was, say, 15 years ago. He's a bit more emotionally driven. He's a bit more similar, actually, to the Red Dragon killer in Hannibal. And he's also buck naked, covered in scars from head to toe. A terrifying, psychotic villain, and a wonderful appearance from Zaz in that sense. The Joker, of course, makes an appearance, and here actually it's worthwhile saying that the art and the humour mesh quite nicely in this story. I'll come to the art in just a moment, but the Joker's humour, I think, works very well. Quite literally, with some poo thrown in here and there, some poop jokes, but then again, it wouldn't be Kevin Smith without some poo humour here and there. But it does work, and I found myself very much enjoying this portrayal of the Joker. He's cold and serious at moments, but then he just goes on a roller coaster. And actually, at one point, there was an attempt to describe the Joker's psychology as a bit like trying to concentrate on something, a task, when there are 6 televisions right next to your face, all on different channels, all switching channels randomly. This man has ultimate ADHD, as it were, and the Joker is portrayed quite well in that sense in this. There's some very witty dialogue as well. I'm not going to spoil any plot points. This is not really a spoiler. This happens very early on, page 2 or 3. Deadshot's been shot dead, says the Joker at one point. Now, whether or not that is Deadshot who's dead, or whether or not blah 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 blah, I'm not going to spoil, but the point is, I like the dialogue. Deadshot's been shot dead. very good. And at one point, actually, the Joker leaves a note for Batman saying, "Eat it, emo boy, J," and then a little heart and kiss. So, in some ways, you can hear the voice of the author coming through. It does sound like the kind of stuff that would be found in a Jay and Silent Bob sort of universe movie, but it also works in the context of Batman. Now, I actually did find myself creating in my head the distinct voices of the characters. So in particular when it came to the Joker, I was imagining pretty much Mark Hamill's Joker voice, and that doesn't always happen for me when I'm reading a Batman story. So again, in terms of the dialogue, some wonderful moments, and well done there. There are some fantastic plot seeds that are woven through the three-part story. In particular, something which is in part 1, which does come to fruition in part 3. I'm not going to spoil it. Also, actually, Maxi Zeus is a fascinating choice as an antagonist. His status in the Gotham underworld, and also his particular psychosis, really does come to play when in terms of the neuroses and how I suppose how the turf war between him, the Joker, and this third player, Onomatopoeia, play out. Now, at this stage, I want to give Walt Flanagan, the artist, a bit of a shout out, as it were. I found his art over the course of these 3 issues to be at moments iconic. Referencing, for example, some of my favourite Batman stories, in particular, for example, the Broken Bat saga. I found it to be loose, in so much as, for example, the way in which the Joker's face sort of morphs almost from panel to panel. It elongates at times and is actually quite emotive. I found to be very interesting, and in that sense, the whole scope of the art in this story has a very dynamic feel. There are a couple of drawings of Batman which I didn't like. I'm not going to show them on screen, but that's just a personal preference. But broadly speaking, the overall artistic tone of this is magnificent. Speaking of which, actually, the covers for the comic books, which are included, as in any good collection, are included in this piece, are magnificent. An artist called Adam Kubert did the covers, and the cover for part 3 in particular really caught my attention. I really liked it, and so in that sense, again, good job. I suppose the only real actual downside for me is that sadly it doesn't feel like Onomatopoeia as a character has an arc that goes anywhere in this. And that was the thing that really excited me the most when I came across in the dust jacket this description and this question of, will that be one of the last sounds that Batman hears, one of these comic book noises? In a sense, he feels in this story a bit like Jaws. He pops up here and there, causes mayhem, and then disappears again. You don't really get a sense of exactly what it is that's driving his quest. We're told, we're given a little bit of backstory from Bruce's research, as it were, about him having killed some low-level vigilantes in a previous story, and indeed I believe that's what's happened in the Green Arrow issue where he appears. But I want to know more about Onomatopoeia, and maybe that's the point. Maybe he is deliberately mysterious, and we'll find out more eventually. But it feels like this could have been an even more interesting book had we just got a little bit more from the character and about the character. At one point, for example, he seems to be using the alias John. Is that his real name or not? I just don't know. I suppose one of the questions that I found myself asking is he sort of hyper self-aware, kind of like Deadpool? You know, does he know that he's in a comic? Is this why when, I think at one point, for example, a Batarang goes into the barrel of his gun, it goes "Fnap" or something like that, or "Fatwang," and he says "Fatwang," and then everything sort of, goes from there. It's as though he's saying what's being written on the page, and so therefore is he, as I say, is he actually sort of poking at that fourth wall, but even breaking the fourth wall? Onomatopoeia feels like a bit of a wasted opportunity for exploration in this story, and perhaps over the course of 3 comics we could have had a very different story played out. instead of onomatopoeia essentially being a sort of supporting chaotic role, he could have actually been a focus of the story. But unfortunately, he's just not quite explored enough, at least for my taste. A little bit like the Deadpool question, actually, I found myself wondering whether or not there were a bit too many meta references. Over the course of only 3 comics, we get references to Calendar Man, John Paul Valley, there was a chap who at one point even had the mantle of the Bat for a short time, one of Clayface's hideouts, the Dark Might turns up as a reference, and also there's even a reference to Lethal Weapon. The Joker at one point is referring to himself, I think, as Danny Glover. But are all of these references a bit too much for 3 stories? They're potentially slightly distracting, and again scratching at that 4th wall, giving it a bit of a poke, but never quite breaking it, and certainly never quite exploring the 4th wall. It's like a mime type fashion. It would have been nice to have seen a little bit more of that. And so the combination of onomatopoeia and all of these sort of bigger universe references, I found slightly disappointing and slightly distracting. Then again, who can blame the man? Who can blame Kevin for doing this? I mean, he's getting to write motherfucking Batman. Of course he's going to want to demonstrate a deeper knowledge of the universe that he's working in. And so I, as I say, as a fan of the Broken Bat saga, did appreciate the reference to Jean Paul Valley, but I just find myself just wanting more. I wanted more, and sadly it wasn't quite delivered. Now, as he does say, as I referred to at the beginning of this video, he does come to the realization, it seems, that this was a dress rehearsal for the best Batman story that he could write. This wasn't the best that he could do, and supposedly there's I think a 12-part series that he followed this up with, which at some point I'm going to have to try and get my hands on now, I think. And so again, I appreciate that. I appreciate that we've been let into the fold. We're allowed to see that this was a process, an experiment, and he was playing. And I can't blame the man for playing. Certainly not. But it does bring me back, I suppose, to the title, Batman Cacophony. The dictionary definition of cacophony, the noun, at least the first definition, is a harsh, discordant mixture of sounds. And that is not only potentially a little insight into the goal of the story. Perhaps it was meant to be a little bit scattergun, a little bit. Let's see what happens when these forces crash together. I can't help but wonder whether or not it was supposed to be a reference to noises and the sounds that onomatopoeia makes. And I can't help but think that at times, if this is a bit too harsh for its own good, it's sweet, it's beautiful, it's filled with references that I appreciated, and it's very satisfying to read, but it's not quite a satisfying ending. And it's very intriguing where onomatopoeia ends up. I'm not going to spoil it. It's very, very intriguing, but I would have liked that ending with a bit more of exploring, especially this question of being aware of the noises and what they sound like in comic book form as opposed to reality. Because guns don't sound like blam, do they? And yet this guy's saying blam. How much does he know about his own existence and what's going on there? I wanted more, and it wasn't quite there. But anyway, nonetheless, I'm so glad I picked this story up, and if you get a chance, you really should give it a bit of a read. Kevin Smith is clearly a huge fan of the source material, and he'll continue to be one of my favourite sort of fringe and alternative Hollywood creators out there. I very much appreciated that he let me in on his process. And I also appreciated that actually he was living the dream, and it was nice to go along for that ride with him. And I'll be going again soon. I'll be reading this story probably again this evening. It's a great book. Anyway, guys, hopefully you found this interesting and or useful. Until next time, do take care. Bye bye.